Now, to moderate the panel, let me introduce one of our most junior faculty, Melanie Kolbe, who is an assistant professor of political science and a specialist in the field of international migration. Thank you, Melanie. Now you are in charge.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Berang. I'm Melanie Kolbe, and on behalf of the Graduate Institute, I also welcome our panelists and, of course, our audience. And I would like to thank the elders for co-hosting this really important talk tonight. My function will be that of a chair. I will kind of guide the discussion tonight. And without further ado, I would like to introduce the panel. Starting from left to right, I welcome first Mr. Kofi Annan, Chair of the Elders and former Secretary General of the United Nations. Next, I welcome Dr. Gro Harlem Brundtland, Deputy Chair of the Elders and former Prime Minister of Norway. We're also honored to have Prince Zeid Zeid Al-Hussein, the current United Nations High Commissioner for Human Rights. Furthermore, I also welcome Ms. Hina Jilani, a member of the Elders, an active lawyer and human rights defender. And finally, I'm pleased to introduce Mr. Bill Swing, Director General of the International Organization for Migration. Before we will delve into the discussion, I would first like to give the word to Mr. Kofi Annan. Mr. Annan?
Thank you very much, Melanie. Let me also introduce other elders who are in the room but not on the podium. It's too small to have all of us, even though we are quite small. Starting on the left, Martti Ahtisaari, former president of Finland. Ella Bhatt from India, and a great activist who does lots of things well. Lakhdar Brahimi, former Hina. Former President Zedillo of Mexico. Mary Robinson, former President of Ireland. And Leslie Ann Knight, the Executive Director of the Foundation of the Francophone Society. And behind them we have lots of people who support the elders and make sure that we do stick to what we are set out to do. And I think perhaps, if you don't mind, Melanie, before we start, I would ask Bill Swing to set the problem. Bill Swing of International Migration, who, like High Commissioner for Human Rights, has been really at the center of this. And so, Bill, if you can set the problem properly for us before we begin our discussions. You have a little more time than anybody else around the panel.
I hope. Yeah. Thank you very much. Thank you. Good evening. Thank you very much. It's indeed a great honor to be with you, and I thank you, Mr. Secretary General, as President of the Elders, for including me in this distinguished panel. I want to make 3 points. Let me start simply by saying that we are in an era of historical human mobility. We have never had quite so many people on the move. It's still about 3% of the world's population, but it's about 1 billion out of our 7 billion world. About a quarter of these crossing borders and 3/4 moving within their own country. I just moved from Miami to New York, and I was told I'm one of these domestic migrants. I don't see it that way, but anyway. So with this, the reason for this is that the world's population quadrupled in the last century for the first time in history. It's unlikely to happen again. So we're going to be dealing with large migration flows for this and many other reasons until about the second half of this century, when the population will level out at about 9 or 9.5 billion. That, I guess, in a way, is probably good news. I don't want to talk about the migrant drivers now, the driving forces. We'll probably come to that later. I want to set the scene by giving you an analogy on my 3 points. My first point is, I think we're in the middle of a perfect storm. We have not only the most number of people moving, but we have the largest unforced migration, forced migration, since the Second World War. If we use the UNHCR figure, about 60 million people, 20 million refugees, 40 million IDPs, and others forced to move. Secondly, we have unprecedented conflicts and simultaneous humanitarian emergencies stretching from the western bulge of Africa well into the Himalayas and beyond, with very few bright spots in between. Apart from Ebola in West Africa, which is now more or less under control, we have had problems in Mali, Burkina Faso. We have Boko Haram in Nigeria. We have the ethno-religious conflict in the Central African Republic, an ongoing civil war in South Sudan, unfinished work in Libya, Yemen, Afghanistan, Iraq, and a 5-year war in Sudan. That may not be even the worst part of it. We have also unprecedented anti-migrant sentiment and policies in which migration has become a very negative word, when in fact we all know migration historically has been overwhelmingly positive. Most of our countries, like my own, was built on the backs and with the talents and brains of migrants. The Secretary General gave me a good quote the other day about roughly 40% of all of the CEOs of the 500 Forbes companies are all either migrants or children of migrants. We know that a large percentage of those who win the Nobel Peace Prize in the U.S. or the Nobel Prize altogether, are migrants. We have also an unprecedented fears on the part of people based on the 2008-2009 economic downturn. They're going to take my job. The fears that come from the post-9/11 security syndrome. The fears of loss of personal or national identity. That person doesn't look like me. Why are they dressed so funny and speak so strangely? We're hung up on that. Then in addition to that, we have unprecedented political malaise. We have a dearth of political leadership. We have unclear power relationships. We have a violation of international humanitarian law on all sides, an erosion of international moral authority, and worst of all, I'm unaware of any active negotiations or political processes that are likely to give us any hope of a short to medium-term solution of any of these. Now, this is in many ways then the perfect storm. Our thesis is, however, that migration is not a problem to be solved or a challenge to be met. It is a human reality that has to be managed. And that's why we're here tonight. Let me also then move to the second point, which is weathering this storm. How do we weather this storm that we're in, the perfect storm? And I think there are a number of ways to do this. First of all, it's important to recognize reality. These movements are going to continue and should continue. We need also to have a perspective on it. We have 700,000 people now who've come north since the beginning of the year, coming into a population area of 500 million. It is something to be managed, but it's manageable within that size population if everyone is on the same page. I think, particularly here in Europe, there are 3 challenges in terms of weathering the storm. Number one, we have to avoid historic and contemporary refugee amnesia. We must not forget. My own organization and UNHCR, we were joined at the hip in 1951. We were both born, basically, to take Europeans ravaged by the war to new shores and a better life. We shouldn't forget that. We know that 60 years ago, there was a revolution in Hungary. A couple 100,000 people fled to open arms in Austria and Yugoslavia. We must also remember right now that Ethiopia, these are poor countries. Ethiopia has been host to 700,000 refugees for a long time, Kenya 400,000, Sudan 200,000, and Lebanon with 4.5 million people is host to more than 1 million. Turkey is now the largest refugee country in the world, and water-poor Jordan is also hosting 1 million migrants, and they have a small population. So I think that's important. The second challenge, it seems to me, is to overcome systemic paralysis, in which not everybody plays by the same rules. Make sure that everybody's unified, and that strengthens us all then in bringing in the rest of the world to help share responsibility. The third one is, I think, is a psychological adjustment that has to be made. I'm talking about Europe right now, a continent that has peopled the world for 400 years, 4 centuries, and now for 4 decades has become a continent of destination, going from being a continent of origin, now a continent of destination, and that takes a psychological adjustment which has to be done, and I think it will be. The other thing, in addition to recognizing realities and adding perspective, we need to have new migration policies. Our policies are virtually all out of date. I'm not talking about open borders, but we simply have to have what I call a high road scenario. We have to have more legal migration channels. We have to use our visa policy much more creatively. We have to have humanitarian visas, temporary protective status for people who are fleeing conflict or abject poverty or political persecution. They may not fall under the 51 Convention, but they need help. We need to be looking also at other ways that we could help out. And I think that we need to have 3 objectives. One is to protect the rights of everyone, whatever their category may be. Secondly, we need very much to be addressing the root causes of people's forced migration. And thirdly, to be promoting safe, orderly, and humane migration. The third thing that needs to be done: dialogue, partnership, and shared responsibility. I'm very pleased that the Khartoum process is still working. Rabat process is going on. And of course, the EU and the African Union will meet in Valletta on the 11th and 12th of November. And we hope that the forgotten part of this, namely the African movements across the Central Mediterranean, will then be restored into the discussion. And we cannot put everybody into the class of economic migrants. Those who don't qualify for the 51 Convention protection are not all economic migrants. We have any number of unaccompanied minors, pregnant women. We have basically Syrians who are heading north to join their family who are already in Scandinavia. And you have other cases who need a particular kind of assistance and protection. And then we need, obviously, communication. Governments that are not doing campaigns of public information, public education, and awareness raising as to why migration is necessary simply are reneging on their responsibility. We need also then, finally, it seems to me, comprehensive migration policies, which up to now has eluded the European Union and a lot of other countries, including, unfortunately, my own, for a long time. So I guess with that, I would say then that the final sort of thing that we need right now is to look at addressing 2 challenges, 3 perhaps. One, we simply have to work to change the public narrative. It's absolutely toxic right now. Migration is negative. Secondly, we have to learn to manage inexorably growing diversity, multicultural, multi-ethnic, multi-religious. That is the future. If we're going to have economies that are functioning and societies that are harmonious. And finally, I think we need to find a way to what I'm using a new phrase called basically trying to address paradoxes, conjugating conundrums, if you will. We have to get a balance between national sovereignty and individual freedom, and between national security and human freedom, and finally come up with a balance that will allow us to go forward. So I think there is a silver lining to that very dark cloud I've painted, but we have to get busy and take action. Thank you.
Thank you very much. So from now, having the problem well situated, kind of bringing us up to speed, I now would like to introduce the High Commissioner. We have the honor of him being here tonight, and I would like to invite him to shed a human rights perspective on the topic at hand. High Commissioner.
Thank you, Melanie. I'm honored to be here to speak to all of you. Across the world, disgraceful human suffering is being generated, avoidable suffering, and the world is badly in need of the experience and wisdom of the elders. And I say this as a representative of the youngers. At least I had to get that in somehow. My children don't believe it, so I have to impress the point. I refer first to the policy disarray of many states with respect to migration. We need far more coherent and principled migration governance, as Bill Swing just pointed out, at global, regional, and national levels. And no matter what their administrative status, migrants are human beings with rights. And the primary aim of systems to manage migration should be their protection. I urge states to stop the routine and often harsh detention of people who are not criminals. In particular, children should never suffer detention because of the irregular status of their families or their parents. Furthermore, the increased militarization of borders with higher fences, bigger guns, drones, and armed warships, armed aircraft and warships, is folly. It comes at enormous human cost, firstly, but huge financial cost too. And it is creating a market for criminal smuggling on a level of organization that is able to circumvent this military-grade technology that is being deployed. I also note that although many countries claim to be leading a war on smuggling, they show little regard for the victims. There should be far greater efforts to ensure that abused migrants have access to remedy and justice. Migration governance could also usefully be reviewed in light of the real needs of labor markets. Several countries where low-skilled labor needs are currently met mainly by migrants nonetheless provide few or even no legal channels for their entry. If xenophobia and political demagoguery are allowed to set the governance agenda, what we will see is more deaths and greater brutalization of society as a whole, with communities that are cleaved from one another and prospects for greater violence. I have been profoundly shocked by the hate-filled rhetoric and even action directed against vulnerable migrants by leaders of some of the world's most prosperous and privileged societies. But alongside these urgent migration governance reforms, there must also be a deep and broad-based effort to address the causes of forced movement. The migration we are seeing today is the living illustration that human rights violations in one country are the business of all. Forced migration is a symptom, a powerful symptom, and one which has many run-on effects. But despair, multifaceted and overwhelming, is its cause. This despair is evident in the flight of refugees from indiscriminate warfare in Syria, oppression in Eritrea, persecution in Myanmar. It is also evident in other forms of forced movement. Children fleeing gang violence in Central America. Young men driven out of Bangladesh by lack of opportunities and broken governance systems. Families forced to move across the Sahel because of water scarcity and land degradation. Only a strong collective action can end these overwhelming human rights violations. Migration also calls us to meet the challenges of integration. This, I believe, is eminently feasible, and it does not threaten the fundamentals of any culture. As Bill Swing just noted, every society on this planet was fashioned by women and men who came from elsewhere, contributing creativity and flexibility and adapting their values to their new homes. I urge states to acknowledge and enable the contributions of migrants without discrimination against them or their children. Equality and a voice builds confidence and cohesion. Rather than viewing migration as a threat, we can see it as an opportunity to build societies in which people, whatever their origins, can express their abilities with hope in the future that is shared. As we mark the UN's 70th anniversary this month, I believe it is time for migration, an issue which touches the 3 pillars of the UN, to be more systematically discussed within the UN structures. There needs to be a multilateral, participatory and accountable global discussion of these many challenges. And I trust that you will use your considerable influence to help states, and I'm speaking to the elders, but also to the students, find the wisdom to meet these challenges together. And finally, I'm proud to say that Bill Swing and I have joined Kofi and the elders in statements we have made collectively to the European Union in particular, but to the global community at large on these issues. And I think we're both very proud to be here together with our colleagues. Thank you so much.
Thank you. I will now basically direct a series of questions at the panel, and we will try to get somehow at those challenges that were so aptly described by Mr. Swing, the High Commissioner. And afterwards, we would like to engage the audience a little bit more and open the discussion to questions from the audience. But let's start out with sort of a warm-up idea about if we want states to respond generously, we might want to emulate countries that have done so in the past. So my first set of questions actually concerns the responses of national governments to forced displacement. And the Nordic countries actually have been for quite a while model citizens of the international community for actually their very generous response to forced migrants and refugees. So my question first goes to Dr. Brundtland. So what benefits, but also what challenges has this approach brought to those countries?
Well, first I think, why have you reason to say that the Nordic countries have been generous? I think, yes, it's true. But I ask myself the question, why? Well, I think it is based on the Nordic vision, the Nordic history of thinking in terms of solidarity and basing policy on equality and on human rights. So given this, the Nordic countries have analyzed and felt that they have to support international humanitarian law and the basic principle of human rights, which leads to saying yes when people are in need. This is why it happened in this way. But you also asked me, have there been challenges? Well, first the benefits. I think they have been already addressed nicely by the two speaking before me. Yes, you get new ideas, you get new types of thinking, you get innovation, you get multicultural impulses to countries that were quite homogeneous, the Nordic countries, before immigration started to happen about 40, 50 years ago. But it has led to considerable change. I know Norway and Sweden most. So what have been some of the challenges? Well, as people have seen change happening in their neighborhoods, in the schools of their children, you have had an increasing sentiment among people that has been easy to play on. That why all this change? Isn't it a little dangerous? You know, and you have examples that parents find themselves having children. We all go to public schools in the Nordic countries. So, you know, students are not put in private schools and avoiding the kinds of common destiny. They go to the same public schools in the same neighborhoods. And as then half and then 3/4 or maybe 90% of students in one class come from foreign countries, then parents start getting nervous. Are my Norwegian children learning Norwegian at school? I don't want to, to give an impression that all of these things have been easy. They haven't. Now, what happened politically? The majority in Norway has been behind this generous policy. They still are. But we had a wave already in 1989. We got a party, coming up in the national elections called the Progressive Party. And by this time, 2015 or 2013, they are now part of the Norwegian government. But with regard to their views about refugees and immigration, they are in minority in the Norwegian parliament, in the Norwegian people. But it happened again, this was 89, when Norway started having to relate to the questions coming from this new surging party, as opening up a discussion about a number of issues that had really not been discussed. There was a lid on that discussion. It was helpful that we started debating a number of the questions that people started asking in the neighborhoods. Because without that, you will get xenophobia and difficulty. So that happened. Then in 2013 or 14, maybe, Sweden had the same surge of something called the Sweden Democrats. And it created real changes in Swedish policy and Swedish government, etc. Now, for me, it's strange. Why did it take 25 years from it happened in Norway to it happened in Sweden? For some reason, but now the debate about our societies, what we, as you said, if politicians, if teachers, if everyone who is in some way responsible is not discussing these issues, explaining to people that we have responsibility, explaining why we have a generous policy, explaining why, given what happens now, we have to continue having a generous policy and expect from others too to be more generous than they are. Others meaning many other countries in the world. This is a large issue, and it needs, as you have been indicating, politicians who show sufficient leadership that they address the issue, explain why, and have people able to follow a reasoning behind it. Because otherwise, it is dangerous. Well.
Thank you very much. Now, I just make the assumption that not everyone exactly is familiar with the very intricate, complex dynamics of forced migration. So I would actually like to ask Mr. Swing to give us a little bit of a brief overview. What are actually the most common denominators around the world that make people move forcibly? And can we maybe get to some general principles and responses that are applicable to a lot of people?
Thank you very much. That's a very key question. I think what we call the drivers of migration, I think in Europe they're generally called the root causes, are about a half dozen, just to keep it short. Obviously the most important one right now are the number of disasters, which I've already described. The other big driver, of course, is demography. We have a demographic deficit. All of the OECD countries are going to have they do have declining populations. Even China is an aging society. They're reaching out, and every time I go to China in the year, they always are looking for new ways to attract skills. How do you get our people to come back home after they're educated, et cetera, in universities? So that is a key one. And I don't think you cannot address a demographic deficit with a compassion deficit. It won't work. And that's what we have right now. So demography is one. Europe's going to need, by any estimate, at least 40 million workers at all skill levels by mid-century, which they won't have. So wouldn't you think that governments would now start saying to the population, let's keep some of these Syrians, most of them are well educated, a lot of them have skills we need, rather than pushing everybody back under the label economic migrant. It won't work. A second driver, of course, is the digital revolution. In the turn of the century, we had 300 million people connected to the internet. Today, it's well beyond 3 billion. If Mark Zuckerberg gets its way, it'll soon be 7 billion. You have the distance shrinking technology. You can get places quickly, cheaply, most cases. We have also the demand for labor. There are great labor demands there. A lot of the unemployment in the developed world is basically structural unemployment. But the dirty, difficult, and dangerous are going to be done by migrants. That's how they start up the ladder. That's the first rung of the ladder. But they go up. They're very creative, very hardworking. There's also the whole question of the degradation of the environment. We'll get into climate change at some point. That's going to be a driver. It already is a driver. I met with President Tong from Kiribati in New York, and we asked him, well, how can the West help? He said, you can't, it's too late. The new definition of statelessness. The state didn't get rid of you, you lost the state. So you buy land in another country for your people. That's all coming down the pike for us. So these are things that are causing it now already. And I think finally, just simply the dreams of people. People have aspirations. They want to get out of abject poverty and find a new life. And that's a noble aspiration. Someone quote a famous philosopher, Jacques O'Neill. Jacques O'Neill said, pressure, what is that? Pressure is when you don't know where the next meal is coming from. That's real pressure. So these are driving forces, if I may. Thank you. Thank you.
So my next question is directed at the High Commissioner, and I think you've given us a fantastic overview over the human rights dimension of this problem. So given that the current situation and of basically a mass movement of forced displaced people across and into Europe, how can we ensure the dignity and the rights of all the persons who are moving, right? How can we ensure somehow a sustainable rights-based response, in particular in the light that some of the European Union countries were just meeting earlier a couple of days ago, and Jean-Claude Juncker said, well, first you have to register and then you can have rights, which I find a little bit difficult, right? So how can we ensure the fair and the dignified treatment?
It's important, of course, to understand that it's not okay to use derogatory language in respect of these human beings, not in the mildest form or not in the most obvious and explicit form. Once you classify people along lines such that they pose a threat, that these are hordes, that we're being invaded, that there's swarms of people coming, you have started the process of dehumanizing them, as we know from history. And you, as the politician, may feel that you're exercising your freedom of expression responsibly, but someone is going to pick up on this term. And down along the line, in some village somewhere, a family will be murdered because someone thought they had license to visit violence on this particular family because the politician in question raised or stigmatized them along a sort of a category which opened the way for that possibility. It doesn't mean that you have to stifle or rather the human desire to express its wishes and will freely, but it does mean that you must do so with due regard given to history and some responsibility. It is important that centers where registration take place not become places of abuse, and all too often they do become abuses. They do become abusive as centers. And then also that long-term detention is simply unacceptable. Detention is only prohibited or only accepted as okay under international law if it's an absolute last resort. And in many cases, we don't see it as a last resort. The UN Committee on the Rights of the Child has also emphasized that detention of children solely on the basis of their migration status or that of their parents is a violation and is never in the best interests of the child or justifiable. Finally, two more points. One is that none of the drivers that Bill spoke of are unseen and a surprise to us. Many of these conflicts have been churning on for years. The extreme poverty has been in place for years. The corruption and exploitation of resources that leads people to leave. The worries about climate change have been there for years. So there are no surprises here. And finally, the main point is that if we don't accept that this is a shared responsibility, and if we're so prepared to mistreat people who've been stripped of practically everything else, then surely we are stripping ourselves of our collective consciousness, or consciousness, and the conscience of each one individually as well. Thank you.
Much. Of course, of very acute importance is right now the situation in Syria. Syria, we have identified as one of the primary catalysts of the current refugee crisis. And now, recently, we also know that Russia has started to intervene more actively in the conflict. And given that the Security Council and the wider international community is quite divided on the issue, I wondered if Mr. Annan could give us a little bit of insight in this. Like, what are the chances, or what chances do you see of any coherent and consistent response or approach being developed to actually exert influence on these warring parties in Syria?
You are right, as your question implies, that the divisions amongst the international community has really been a problem in our attempts to resolve the Syrian conflict. In my judgment, the only way we can resolve the Syrian conflict is for the big powers, members of the Security Council, possibly with Germany, working together with the regional powers. By the regional powers, I mean Saudi Arabia, Turkey, Iran, Egypt, and Qatar, to try and come up with a common framework to resolve the issue. Lakhdar Brahim is here, both of us tried. When I started at the beginning, I looked at it from the bottom. If we can get the Syrians to work together, came up with a 6-point plan, trying to get the Syrians to come together. But as the country began to splinter, and today people will tell you have about 1,000 militia, different militia on the ground. So if you start from the grassroots up, how do you organize these people and get them together? And that was one of the reasons we went the other route, and in 2012, in Geneva, on 30 September, organized the first Geneva conference, which led to the Geneva Communique, basically making those governments who are funding the wars, who are giving money and arms to the parties responsible, getting them to play a role, work together to resolve the conflict. And if they genuinely work together, they could, perhaps it was too early in 2012, maybe it wasn't ripe, but today we see contacts that were not possible in 2012 or even a year ago, where you are seeing meetings between the Russians, the Saudis, the Americans, and the Turks, trying to find a common solution. I hope they will stick with it and work together to resolve it. And this is, I often refer to the European experience after the 30-year war. Europe had to come together to realize that a senseless war destroying the region and killing each other wasn't the solution. And they came together and we got the Treaty of Westphalia. I hope they would also have their Westphalia moment working with the international partners to resolve this issue. And in this situation, the role of Russia and the US are key. If the two of them find a way of working effectively together and working with the others, we would find a solution. No war goes on forever. There will be a solution. The question is when. The Syrians have suffered for far too long, and it's about time we really all pulled our efforts to get it done. In fact, today everybody is concerned about Syria. The concern has heightened to a level in Europe and America which wasn't there a year ago. And why? Because the refugees have brought it home. The refugees are on our soil. As difficult as that problem is, if that had not happened, we will not be discussing Syria and looking at Syria the way we are. We are doing it because we are suddenly directly affected. And I hope the efforts will continue.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Now, one other very prolific exporter of migrants is also the country of Pakistan. And I hope that Ms. Hina Jilani can actually cast some light on what conditions in Pakistan have led to the situation of migration, immigration, and what are there maybe common sources that we can see that unites Pakistan's refugees with other ones from other areas?
Well, let me say first of all that the driving force, as Mr. Swing has said, driving migration out of Pakistan is somewhat the same as many other countries where there is not an open conflict going on. But remember, Pakistan is a country where conflict is there, however much people may deny it. It's been in a state of low-intensity conflict for more than a decade now. So let me say the first situation that I see is that of people looking for livelihood. And I think although Pakistan is not one of the countries which is generally thought of as being in the grip of extreme poverty, the reality is that different factors have made it extremely difficult for people to have a better future and more opportunities. And it is looking for more opportunities that is driving them and compelling them to go. And I use the word forced migration in their case because of what I see as a very evident discrimination in the lack of legal channels for migration against particularly certain groups and certain people and certain nationalities, and Pakistan is one of those. And I think this is where this kind of economic migration that we are calling is not a mild situation. It becomes a very urgent situation for people lacking opportunities, looking for a better future, and not having the legal means to do it. But also remember, as I said, Pakistan has been in a state of conflict for many, many years. There are several other factors which are affecting people's lives and livelihoods. Of course, the whole question of terrorism and counterterrorism, both are driving forces. Firstly, terrorism. In Pakistan, 60,000 civilians have been killed so far at the hands of terrorists in different kinds of terrorist attacks. People who were actually living in areas which from time to time come under the control of religious extremist forces and militant extremist forces are forced to flee those areas. And Pakistan also has over 1 million people who are internally displaced because of that factor. But when these internally displaced people do not find the protection and the way forward to build a new life within their country, that is also one of the driving forces that drives them out to look for greener pastures. The other issue that I think would be very important for a place like Pakistan, and I'm sure that that's also true of many other countries, who have people coming out and adding to the influx of migrants, is the whole question of discrimination. The biggest problem that we have is sectarian conflict, which is ongoing in Pakistan for many years. And this sectarian conflict doesn't rest at just discrimination and denial of opportunities. This sectarian conflict leads to killings. So there have been several thousand sectarian killings. So certain people who belong to a particular sect have had to leave because there is no more any space or tolerance for their existence in that country. The other issue, of course, which is related to the whole issue of sectarianism and minorities, safety and protection of minorities, Pakistan is a 95% Muslim majority country. Suddenly, with the state policy in the 80s enforcing the whole idea of the superiority of the Muslim population, the minorities became very vulnerable. And unfortunately, we have seen a depletion of the minority population in Pakistan, especially the non-Muslim population. So we've had Christians, Hindus, and Parsis in particular who've had to move out. And many of them have had to take the difficult road in moving out. In the end, I just want to say that these are forced migration situations because their existence is threatened in that country. And imagine the route that these people have taken. It is a route that has very high risks. Why would people take that route unless there was a compulsion to do it?
Thank you. Now, from what we've discussed so far, I think it's valuable to point out that individuals do not just leave because of certain factors, not just the push factors that makes them leave, but that where they go is also determined, and we refer to this usually as pull factors, right? And I think that's very important to see that these things become very closely intertwined, and we cannot just isolate one cause or one motivation for leaving. And I think what probably most of us can agree on is that in the case of Syria and Pakistan, we have individuals fleeing because of generalized violence, right, or very gross human rights violations. And the thing is that it's often impossible or very difficult for individuals to actually generate the documented evidence that is needed for proving that they've been individually persecuted as some governments interpret the 1951 convention, right? So this is in particular really troublesome because some states, in particular in the global north, seem to ignore this reality we're talking about of the causes of mass flight and basically use the convention to restrict the responsibility to protect, to basically argue individuals from Syria are not individually persecuted based on race, religion, ethnic identity, or membership in a political group. So, therefore, I would like to ask the High Commissioner, how can now the international human rights framework actually be used to bring states to meet their obligations towards those forcibly displaced, and how can we kind of put some measures into place to prevent the discrimination we've been talking about so much?
You're absolutely right that although conceptually there are differences between refugees and migrants, in reality they share the same burdens, and they share the same suffering, the same extreme poverty. They can share the same space on a ship, in a truck. They can suffocate from the lack of the same oxygen. They suffer from the same stigmatization and violence by xenophobes who don't discriminate on the basis of whether someone is a migrant or a refugee. A xenophobe will hate all foreigners irrespective. And in reality, the differences are such that the experiences overlap. And we talk about complex flows, but in reality also we talk about common experiences. And so parsing all of this out can be extremely difficult. Where the human rights angle is really excellent is that it doesn't discriminate between human beings on any basis like that. All human beings are entitled to a dignified reception, to remedies on the basis of individual situations being apprised, to right to counsel, right to health. In some detention centers in Europe, and this is absolutely shocking, that you could have people detained for extended periods of time without even being able to smell the outside air, without the right to see a doctor if ill, without the right to see a lawyer if they need one. I mean, it's just unbelievable that we've reached this state of affairs, and so much of it is being stoked by fear, and fear on the basis of rather more sort of irrational concerns. For the bigot, the chauvinist, the racist, it really doesn't matter how many people turn up or don't. Even one family that is different or foreign is enough to make an issue out of it. And we have to be so careful that we don't give ground or yield ground to people who think like that. The world will be an impossible place for you people, for the students in this graduate center, if we were to think that somehow a world of walls and barbed wire and pickets and machine guns is the world we want to inhabit. How on earth is the European Union going to see the free flow of goods and services if at the same time it's going to run rigorous checks on every single person crossing every single border? You can absolutely forget that there can be an economic revival for this continent if we work on that basis. So the pressing needs of the moment is for all of us to be more humane, and the human rights framework provides for that.
Thank you. Now, several countries in Europe have actually witnessed a surge of a lot of xenophobic populism and parties that quite aptly exploit this. And we've seen this going on for the last couple of years, but we've just had 2 national elections in Switzerland and also in Poland, where we see again the conservative and or far-right parties gaining. And so now the current influx of refugees risks sort of aggravating that. We can see a couple of those problems already arising in Germany. And now my question is for the former head of the Norwegian government, Dr. Brundtland. How should national governments and supranational bodies actually respond to the public concerns without either alienating the electorate, but also not pandering to their prejudices?
Well, you know, the question posed the way you did now is the $100 question, isn't it? You know, how can leaders in Europe or in other places where challenges are real deal with it in the best possible way? So I think I mentioned earlier that leaders have to address the issues seriously. They have to be campaigning. They have to be explaining. There is no, simple way to turn your head away and talk about other issues. So because these issues are real, they are dramatically now big in such a way that it really should occupy the minds of the leaders, the parliaments, of civil society of all our countries. Now, I'm watching what happens in my own country, and as I said, the majority of the Norwegian parliament, not only a small majority, but a clear majority, is for doing the right thing in this situation. So they are pushing a government that is conservative and so-called progressives, meaning far right, pushing that government to take the majority view of the Norwegian parliament as the basis of policy. So we are seeing this now going on, the push for more budgetary resources, the push for more people, as you said, to manage a situation that is quite dramatically more intense with regard to what it requires, given the conditionalities that both of you have presented here about humane treatment, about human rights, about taking care of children without parents, etc. It's a long list, and it's big, you know. And now, so to avoid increase in the potential for sentiment of xenophobia and skepticism, I am sure that one thing that one should not do is have a policy where some of these budgetary restraints and the needs, in fact, for considerable resources to be mobilized, that they directly or indirectly seem to hit some of the poorer and less, people who feel that they need the support of their own society. If that happens, then what you are warning against is going to continue. So, in a country like Norway, although the oil price has fallen below 50, etc., Norway can deal with this situation by discussing how do we get sufficient budgetary means to meet the present quite large numbers of people coming to Norway. And of course, and another issue, Syrians. I think now I saw the statistics, it's like 98% or 99% of those coming from Syria are accepted immediately as asylum seekers and given all the possibilities, benefits, etc. So there is no trial to kind of push back on reality in that sense. But when you then have to have a public debate about where does those resources come from, it's better to increase taxes from richer and middle and higher levels of society than to start pulling back in budgetary areas where it is going to hit people who will feel that they are being hurt by this. They shouldn't be. So for me, this is important. I see now that the Prime Minister of Norway has given a statement in Parliament only a few days ago. She's given an interview so far, but she is indicating that maybe we should look at the total cost per person coming to Norway. I think that's realistic. She is saying we have had a very high level of quality on everything that has to do with how we manage the, people, integrating them into society, giving them housing, giving them schooling, health, everything. Now that has to continue, but I can support a conservative prime minister who says we have to look at whether there is a little cost reduction that can be made per person when we have, like 100 times as many coming in. So, I think people should also be pragmatic in those countries where the highest level of attention has been given. Because I think, again, people who are not refugees will more easily nod to the reality of these needs if they see that there is a solid way avoiding hurting people who shouldn't be hurt by this because of budgetary constraints, and therefore making compassion something that more people are able to give. Yes, Norwegians, as well as Germans and many others, are raising up helping people now in this situation. They are going down to meet the refugees coming across the ocean from North Africa. People are using their vacation and spending their own money. So there is compassion, because I think you said we need compassion. Yes, and people are showing compassion. So if the politicians are showing compassion and explaining why that compassion is necessary, then it will also be possible to find the resources in the best possible way in every country that is richer than the ones they came from.
Mr. Annan actually has a good question. Yeah. We're not quite done.
Now, Gru, you made a point earlier that mainstream politicians have to speak to the people, have to explain to them what is happening. In most of these countries, it is not happening.
No.
They tend to follow the extreme parties, thinking that's where the votes are, even though there may be minority percentage of votes. But I believe, like you, that if one explains honestly and frankly to the public, they are not that stupid. They will get it. How do we get the politicians to lead and to explain to the public? Anyway, the other comment I would want to make, you said you raise taxes on the rich, which I agree with you, but you are lucky you are not running in the US presidential election. You would have lost tonight. Yeah.
Well, it was, you know,
Yeah.
Would you like to respond?
you
Yes.
supplemented my comments in a very nice way. No, I do agree with you. It is, you ask a question also. How do you get those
The
politicians who don't have sufficient courage
Yeah.
to show a little more? Well, you certainly cannot have them get that courage without speaking out about the issues.
Yeah.
That's the only way, because there is difference between politicians. Some have it in them. Others are more basically, I wouldn't say only shy, but not courageous. Yeah.
Good.
It's true. You're right.
Thank you. So this is very good. So this is really an issue of leadership, right?
Yeah.
So talking about something that actually Mr. Swing was introducing at the beginning is that the regional scope is really important, and the coordination with the countries that are in the region affected by the refugee movement is really important. And what we can see here is that most of the time the countries that are responsible for hosting, at least temporarily, refugees are the ones in regional proximity to the migrant-producing country. So which at that moment is Turkey, Jordan, and Lebanon, which very high numbers, sometimes really changing the composition of in the number of their own host population. Now, on the other hand, we know that a lot of the Gulf states, as Mr. Swing was talking about, it's kind of like Saudi Arabia, have been very reserved about helping or providing help to the Syrians. So now my question is to Mr. Annan, how can these international institutions and actors that we have actually kind of address this enormous imbalance in hosting refugees? This responsibility is really imbalanced, and how can we address this?
There's been lots of interesting discussions on this topic. Europe these days, you talk of burden sharing and coordinating national efforts. And in fact, last night, as the elders, we were talking about the best way to fund humanitarian activities and support. Normally, in these international organizations, you have two forms of budgeting. Either it's an assessed contribution, where you take a look at the total budget and determine what amount each country should pay, and they're obliged to pay it. Or you can say, we are going to rely on voluntary contributions to manage a program. So far, we rely on voluntary contributions to handle humanitarian crisis. So when the crisis hit, whether it's a UNHCR, IOM, to some extent the High Commissioner's Office, will make an appeal. We'll make an appeal, we need X amount of dollars to look after the refugees. In some situations, they are lucky if they get 20% or even 13%. I can recall in my whole career only one situation where an appeal was oversubscribed, and that was a tsunami. In fact, I asked my staff to think it through and try and identify why we did so well with tsunami. We came to the conclusion that, first of all, it was an international event. There were so many nationalities involved. You saw a German mother looking for a child, or a British boy looking for the mother. So it was an international event. Everybody was touched by this. And above all, it was Christmas, time of giving. And the public became very generous. In fact, we got more money in some countries from the public than from the governments. They were very, very generous. This is not something you can repeat all the time. The other problem is that humanitarian activities and the response to them tend to be concentrated in the north. We need to relax and get other regions involved. We need to get Middle East, we need to get Asia, Latin America and Africa involved in this process. And here again, I can give an example of tsunami. When the tsunami occurred, we were going to have a pledging conference here in Geneva. President Widodo called me and said, why do it in Geneva? I would be grateful if you can do it in my region so that I can rope in my neighbors, get their support, and get them to work with me. We did the pledging conference in Jakarta. We got as much money, if not more, than we could have raised in Geneva. And the neighbors were pulled in, Thailand, Singapore, everybody. So we have to give them a chance to play a role. And I would want to see, recently we've done some of it in the Middle East, but it's not enough. Yeah, Kuwait, which was very generous. We need to get the other regions involved. We need to explain that sometimes it's not just giving money, but actually taking in some of the people and helping them and getting them to get their life back on track is the way to go. So I would push for genuine internationalization of these efforts, not that it happens in the south and there's the action in the north to collect money to go and look after them, particularly when you're saying there could be money in the Middle East. Why haven't we tried to raise it? Years ago when I was with the High Commission for Refugees, we've got a first check from Saudi Arabia and everybody was very excited. We got $36 million from them, which was a major contribution. There's another story attached to that which I wouldn't bore you with tonight. But really, we have to make it our collective effort and not necessarily one side doing something for the other. And approach properly, I'm sure over time we will get them to play their role. And I don't know, Bill and Zeid, who are dealing with this, I think you're getting a bit more response from them.
Well, thank you very much. Clearly, as you say, the Emir of Kuwait has held his pledging conference every January for 3 years now and raised between $2 and $3 billion. And it's kind of helpful when he starts he makes his initial remarks and he says, I'll start the appeal with 500 million. That helps, encourages everybody to go back and see if they've really done well. And so, various countries go back and call home and say, this is not very much. But as you say, it's not just money. I think we have never to this day given enough public credit to the 6 neighbors of Libya and the 4 neighbors of Syria, who to this day have kept their borders open. When the High Commissioner for Refugees and I flew down to the Libyan border in March of 2011, they were coming across the border into Tunisia, 5,000, 6,000 a day, and we started trying to start decongesting the port area, get them out of there. And everybody did that at great sacrifice. We mentioned already, and all 4 neighbors of Syria doing the same thing today, and that deserves. For example, unfortunately, they're all middle-income countries. Yeah. Shouldn't the World Bank and IMF let up a little bit on this middle-income status to say there's an exception here? They need money at very soft terms here. And the High Commissioner for Refugees Mr. Guterres has made that point on a number of occasions. There are more creative ways we can do it.
And there's competition amongst them.
Absolutely.
I talked about tsunami, but then there was earthquake in Pakistan soon thereafter. And of course, immediately, President Musharraf said we should also have the Pledging Conference in Pakistan, which we did. But there was an interesting story to it, because after the tsunami, I asked former President Clinton to be an envoy of the Secretary General for the reconstruction. And he accepted it enthusiastically and all this. So after the earthquake in Pakistan, I told President Musharraf, I think we're going to appoint an envoy, and I have a good man for you. He's dynamic, he will do this. He said, who? I said, Jim Wolfenson of the World Bank. He's dynamic. And I thought you were going to jump at it. He looked at me and said, well, he's a nice man. I like him. But you gave Indonesia a president. And you are giving us head of the World Bank. Can't you? I said, there's only one Clinton. He said, there are other presidents. So I went and got George Bush Sr., President Bush Sr., who accepted to do this. And a couple of months later, I met George Bush at the White House, where he said, thank you, Kofi, I understand you gave my dad a job. So we laughed about that.
Fantastic. Thank you. On this, actually, this is quite a great segue, and I think as the last question before we want to move to the Q&A, I would really like to talk about the challenges of climate change, the tsunami definitely, and the flood shortly afterwards are some of the indications, but we have some more of that. And I would like to ask Mr. Swing about the international policy and legal frameworks that we have at the moment. Can they actually deal with environmental refugees, or how will they be classified? Because it's probably the next challenge. The Geneva Convention does not say anything about climate change being persecuting people. So how are we going to address this?
Look, I think this is the key policy question that we're going to have to give a lot more thought to. I think the UNFCCC, that will meet again in Paris in December, is the right forum for it. But I do recall, having gone to all of these, starting in Copenhagen in 2008, that it took until Cancun in 2010 even to get a reference in the climate change documents about migrants and displaced population. And I asked you, what is more serious about climate change than displaced populations? So that's the first point. I think we need to be much more attention to that issue. The second point is our reading of the situation is that, and here we differ somewhat from some of our UN colleagues, we believe that most of the climate change displacement was likely to be internal, except obviously for Pacific Islands and places like that, where you've got a problem of losing the whole state. We think the majority will stay within the country, and that therefore has to be addressed very carefully. But I think we will have more and more persons moving because of climate change. We're seeing some of these now. It's always hard to identify which is climate change and which is another factor, but it's going to be major.
Thank you very much. Now, I hope that the conversation has inspired some of our audience to ask a couple of questions, and I would like to open up the floor for this. So if you would like to ask someone, the entire panel or one panelist in particular, a question, please put your hand up. And I suggest we will take 3 questions at a time and then give some more time to the panel to answer the questions. Please, in the interest of time, quickly introduce yourself and make your questions as concise as possible, preferably in Twitter format, right? So, yes, the gentleman over there. 20 minutes, fine.
Thank you. Really, the cause problem, it is how to deal with the Syrian crisis. I have a question to both Ambassador Swing and High Commissioner. My name is Ibrahim. I am the former ambassador of Yemen in Geneva. My question to Ambassador Swing that you have called that in dealing with the challenges, that societies in the north has to realize that you are calling for multicultural, multi-religion. Don't you think that there is a fear to Islamization in the West, and this fear of Islamization considers from some part of the society and some government, it is a threat to Europe. This is my questions to you, sir. My questions to High Commissioner is that you dealt with the smugglers, you spoke about the smugglers and children. What is your message in regard to give right of the children, Syrian refugees, right of education at this time, and how you call the international community how to stop and preventing human rights violation in regard of smugglers? Thank you.
Thank you. One more question, and then we go. The young lady over there, please. Yes, one more question.
Is it on? Yes. Well, thank you very much, first of all, for your very interesting and insightful discussion. I'm Laura Sheska. I'm a Mercator Fellow for International Affairs. I'm quite surprised that we haven't mentioned at all the non-state actors in the whole discussion surrounding Syria. Mr. Annan, you mentioned that we require collaboration between the Middle Eastern countries to find a solution, but because these non-state actors are outside of international law, or at least they behave that way, how do you see them in the solution? Where do you think the international community can intervene, or what can even be done?
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you. Great. So I think the first question was about the fear of Islamization, and Mr. Swing.
No, thank you, Mr. Best. Good to see you again. Very good. Thank you very much. No, wonderful. I've always been a good friend. No, I think we have to realize that we're largely dealing in today's world with stereotypes that are both false, damaging, and in many cases dangerous. We have to go for much more evidence-based policy. There's a book came out last year that is very, very well worth reading. It's called The Myth of the Muslim. I think it's called The Myth of the Muslim Invasion, by a British journalist. It lays out all the facts in there and we're dealing with mythology. We did, and I'll give a little publicity to our flagship publication, World Migration Report. In 2011, we surveyed countries throughout the world and asked them, how many foreigners do you think are in your country? Every country, US, Italy, countries in the Far East and elsewhere, grossly overestimated by about 3 times. In point of fact, in the United States today is 13%. It'll vary from state to state, 13%. Not exactly an invasion. 700,000 is not exactly an invasion either in Europe. But so we have to deal on the basis of evidence there. And this means that we've got to go back to this point of beginning to have the political courage and the vision, as we say, to tell it like it is, to lay out the facts for the people, explain to them why it's in the national interest that you have a migration policy that deals with human realities today. But we're way out of touch. We got this idea that every tourist is a potential terrorist. People are afraid that people coming in on the smugglers' boats are terrorists. We say, no. If they don't come first class, they come at least business class. So we've got this, it's all mythology. When I studied in Germany back 40 years ago, there was a professor named Rudolf Bultmann, a German, and he had a thing called demythologizing. And we need to demythologize migration. These are all fears that are unfounded, but we won't know that if governments aren't publicly educating and informing their clientele, their citizens.
Thank you. The second question was about the impact on children, right?
Before I get to this question, in listening to the panelists, they reminded me of an epiphany that I had which is relevant in my mind, at least, to the challenge and the importance of integration. Many of us who have the privilege of residing in Switzerland have a pressure to integrate our behaviors into the Swiss way of life. And for those of you who live outside of Geneva Canton, the experience of recycling is initially daunting. So the first time I went with my recycling boxes, and I'm standing there in front of the plastic bin, and who knew that there were two sorts of plastic bottles, the PET bottles and the regular. So I'm throwing all my plastic in, and this man comes and he's screaming at me, and I have no clue. I haven't been shouted at since I was a little boy. So then I went back home, and I realized there was this instruction from the cantonal authorities. And the following week, I was in Bern, and I had a meeting with the federal president, President Samaruga. So I told her of my problems with integrating into recycling, the recycling method. And so the next time I thought I had got it all sorted out. So I went to the recycling center, but I looked nervous. And the moment I walked there, the man started to follow me. And I stood in front of the bin, and I was so panicked by this stage that I threw in the wrong bottle. And again, he started to scream. And then I realized I'm standing there, and I'm in shock, and I'm practically shaking. And the man leaves, and a Swiss gentleman just walks up very confidently, and throws all the plastic in, PET and no PET. And then I realized the lesson was not to necessarily learn the rules, but to watch the Swiss. And learn how the Swiss do it, and you'll be okay. And so I shouldn't be saying this, because you have to go by the rules. It's not okay. It's not okay not to go by the rules. No. On the serious point of children, of course, they are the further victims. Their victimhood is accentuated by the fact that they're children. The amazing thing is that resilience, and as so many have said, you give them a chance, though, and they will succeed. I remember talking to a sociologist in Bayreuth many years ago, and he said to me, what's astonishing is, of course, the first generation will struggle, and they will struggle with language, and they could be seen as sapping the strength of the benefit system that you have in place. But he said, what's so remarkable about the second and third generation is how much they achieve. And he said what rankles sometimes the extreme right wing, in Germany he was saying this, was not the fact that they had trouble integrating, but the fact that many of the second and third generation spoke German in a superior sense, and knew the literature of the great giants of German literature better than others. And that's what rankled the extreme right. And so it's much more complex than most people present it in terms of the sort of binary fashion. Foreigners are to be distrusted. They're all thieves and a drain on our societies. And we have to be very careful we don't fall into that.
Thank you. And also, on our question, so the role of non-state actors was for Mr. Annan.
Yeah. No, I think the non-state actors are today playing a very important role in the conflicts around the world, and you cannot ignore that. How you deal with them is quite different. In fact, Lakta may want to ask something, since he has managed to bring quite a few of the Syrian groups here to Switzerland to talk to. But the point I was making is that eventually you would deal with them, you would talk to them. But you have to organize it in such a way that those who are pulling the strings, that those who have influence on them, that those who are funding the war will come together to say, this is it, we are not going to fund it anymore, and work with them to influence the groups, the non-state actors that they are funding. It is also quite tricky when you go to the negotiating table. Syrian crisis started as a peaceful demonstration of people wanting a say and who governs them and how they are governed. And then, of course, the government reacted brutally, and we know the story today. If we were to decide to have a Syrian conference today, and we want all the non-state actors to come to the conference, whom are you going to focus on? The political opposition or the military opposition? Will the military opposition, who now dominate more or less on the ground and have been fighting for quite a while, believe that the political opposition, who have not suffered as much as they have the right to speak for them? It has to be arranged in such a way that you hear their voices, but there is a tendency sometimes to give more voice to the armed opposition because they are louder, they have guns, and they often push their way into the conference room, but you need the others, and it has to be very, very carefully managed or planned. Otherwise, you deprive the political opposition of voice, and the armed opposition dominate. And when you look at some of these situations, is a phenomena that we face. So you deal with them, but you have to plan it very carefully and know at what stage you bring them in. If you were to start the Syrian process today with the non-state actors, armed and unarmed, I would tell you the results you are likely to have and the complications you would have, and the fighting between the armed and the unarmed opposition, which will have to be managed. Lakta, I don't know if you want to add, given your own experience. Yeah.
Okay. So I think I would like to do a quick second round. We're a little bit over time already, but I know that it's a very interesting topic. We have first the gentleman up here, the lady in the green shirt and the blazer. And then the lady over there is having her hands up. Fantastic.
Jacques Markovich, University of Sao Paulo, Brazil. My question is to Dr. Jilani. First of all, I want to congratulate the panel. Dr. Jilani, you are the one that said that in the case of Pakistan, fundamentalism, intolerance has been the cause of sectarian persecution and the migration of many minorities. The same situation is in Syria, with persecution against Christian, Armenian, and other minorities, including Kurds. Which are your thoughts about how to deal with this extremism, fanatism, intolerance that also is a cause of migration in many parts of the world?
Thank you.
I think you're right. Sorry.
Well, let's do one question. Yes.
Hi, thank you for a very interesting discussion. My name is Paulina. I'm working at the World Economic Forum, and I would like to ask what your opinion is on who you think should be driving these response efforts forward. Should it be governments, supranational institutions, civil society, and what role do you think the private sector can and should play in all of this? Thank you.
Okay. Yeah. So in the interest of time, I would ask the panelists for short answers, and I would also like to give the last word to Mr. Barang to kind of conclude to us. So the first question was to Ms. Jilani.
Yes, I think this is a problem that is becoming extremely acute in many regions of the world, including South Asia and Southeast Asia. You see in Myanmar what is happening with a lot of an increase in Buddhist extremism. In Sri Lanka, the same trend is being followed. In India, we see other kinds of intolerance. I think there has to be an answer. And while I would certainly never want that religion should be in any way underestimated as a positive force in many ways. We as societies have to go beyond that. We have to make sure that our economic well-being and our political well-being becomes as important. And for that purpose, I think the whole question of identity and citizenship, giving way to common benefits and common welfare, is something that leaders should promote. Unfortunately, we do have non-courageous leaders. But if they really want to be called leaders, then they should act as leaders and not follow, and inform their public opinion, and rather change trends within social and public mindsets that dehumanize people on the basis of being the other.
Thank you. And then the last question, Mr. Annan, would you like to answer?
I think on the question of who pushes the reforms, obviously the governments have responsibility, but we also all have responsibility, having lived through what we are living through now. The public debate that Guru referred to can inform what governments do. Civil society can put pressure on governments to do what is right, to come up with the right laws. We don't have to leave it to the politicians alone. And from what we've seen, and Bill and the High Commissioner have made it quite clear that we are not applying the laws that we have. We are not protecting the people the extent that we have. And there are gaps and weaknesses in the law that we need to fill. And obviously the governments will have to take the lead, but civil society, the private sector, has a role to play, particularly if you bear in mind the point that Bill made, that governments are going to need lots of immigrants. They're going to have to bring in immigrants to be able to maintain the economic standards of their societies, particularly those countries that do not have replacement rate when it comes to demographics. And companies are going to need these able-bodied men and women to work in their factories. And I think it is extremely important, since these refugees or migrants are going to be in the country anyway, that they are allowed to work. If they are allowed to work, it permits them to blend, to adjust, and get to know their society faster. It also helps the population accept them. What populations object to is when they see able-bodied men and women kept in ghettos in a city, not allowed to work, and being fed by the government. And it's our tax money is the attitude. If they are earning their way and making a contribution, it's much easier to accept them. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Let me ask everybody to stay at your place while our guests are leaving the room. So please stay in your place. And let me thank everybody on the panel. Melanie, obviously, you did it extremely well, and the members of the panel. Thank you.
And it's good to have the intergenerational thing that you did.